Welcome to the Freak Show, fellow freaks.
I'm Matthew Brockmeyer.
And I'm Christa Carmen.
And this is
Murder Coaster.
We're back with Season 3 of Murder Coaster. Did you miss us? And it's Vampire October, where every week we will bring you true tales of blood-drinking ghouls. And boy, oh boy, do we have a doozy for you today. One of the most vile, disturbing, twisted, and terrifying true stories you have ever heard. The story of Peter Kürten, the infamous Vampire of Düsseldorf. And to start with the immortal opening words of The Sadist, the first modern true crime book ever published. Quote,
In the whole history of crime, there is to be found no record comparable in circumstances of frightfulness with the long series of crimes perpetrated by the Dusseldorf murderer, Peter Kürten. The epidemic of sexual outrages and murders that took place caused a wave of horror and indignation to sweep not only through Dusseldorf, but, and may it be said without exaggeration, throughout the whole world.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Vampire October.
Let's begin. Prologue: The Vampire Ghost. It is said that the Ripley's Believe It or Not Museum in Wisconsin Falls, Wisconsin, is haunted by a vampire ghost. And indeed, if one were to wander the halls, there among the weird artifacts, the animal oddities, like the two-headed calves, the skulls and the bones, bizarre illusions and strange works of art, one would find the mummified head of an actual vampire, split in half and hanging from a rusted metal hook. The head of infamous German serial killer Peter Kürten, the Vampire of Düsseldorf.
Yes, a real-life vampire. But we're not talking about a fanged, undead creature of the night, but a sadistic killer suffering from hematolagnia, a sexual fetish for blood. A man who became overwhelmingly sexually stimulated by the sight, smell, and even sound of blood, as well as suffering clinical vampirism or the compulsion to drink blood. A real vampire.
Peter Kürten was a terrifying monster whose depravity knew no bounds. In fits of sexual depravity and bloodlust, he killed with knives, scissors, hammers, chisels, his own bare hands, attacking women, men, and children, as well as animals, sucking their lifeblood from their bodies. He was an arsonist, a rapist, a thief, committing every crime known to man in a decades-long spree of mayhem and horror.
After his eventual arrest in 1930, Peter spent over a year speaking with court-appointed psychiatrist Dr. Carl Berg, telling him his life story, which would be printed verbatim in the book The Sadist, widely considered the first modern true crime book, complete with grisly autopsy reports and incredibly disturbing crime scene photos, and which is our main source for today's episode.
And now let's get on with the tale of Peter Kürten. But be forewarned, it is an incredibly disturbing and gruesome story, and we mean that most sincerely. This story will shock you to your core, and that is a guarantee. So listen with caution.
Chapter 1. Little Peter.
Peter Kürten, the Vampire of Düsseldorf, was born on May 26, 1883, in Mulheim am Rhein, a town on the Rhine River across from the city of Cologne. He was the oldest of 13 brothers and sisters.
The large family lived in crushing poverty, inhabiting a one-bedroom apartment in a tenement building in a slum on the border of the city's industrial district where Peter's father worked in a factory.
Peter's father was an alcoholic and sexual deviant who would often spend his entire paycheck on liquor and prostitutes, leaving the family desperate for food and rent money. He was a violent man who would savagely beat his wife and children, all of whom were often seen bruised and bloody.
The cruelty and degradation of Peter's father was beyond the pale. It is said he would stagger into the apartment in the middle of the night, drunk and out of his mind, kicking the family awake. He would then gather all the children together, line them up around the only bed in the little apartment, and force them to watch as he raped their mother. If she tried to resist in any way, he would beat her senseless.
And sadly, there was nothing she could do, for at that time there were no laws against marital rape.
But Peter's father soon took his sexual deviance to horrible new levels, raping Peter's sisters as well, and even sexually assaulting Peter himself.
And this is the world little Peter grew up in. Blinding poverty, brutal violence, incest, and savage sexual assault. And at just 9 years old, he committed his first murders.
As part of Germany's ongoing reforms to the education system, Peter and his classmates were part of a program to bring urban children to the outdoors and teach them survival skills. City kids and children of factory workers were brought to the Rhine River, where they were taught how to fashion their own wooden rafts by binding logs together with rope. The children then set off paddling their rafts down the tranquil river.
Peter was paired with 2 other boys, whom he built a raft with. Then, as they leisurely floated down the slow-moving Rhine, Peter began to playfully rock the raft, and one of his little companions began to shout, clutching at the raft's edge. Nine, I can't swim. Please don't rockens the raft.
Well, Peter said, there's only one way to learn how to swim. And he kicked the kid right into the river, laughing as the child flailed in the water.
What have you done? The other boy shouted, and leapt into the water to save his friend, dragging him back to the raft and calling for Peter to pull them back up.
Peter squatted down as if to lend a hand, but instead of helping, Peter grabbed the boy by the hair and held his head underwater, watching in fascination as he struggled.
As the boy kicked and flailed, desperately trying to lift his head up, something strange happened to Peter. A warmth spread over him. He became incredibly sexually aroused and had his first orgasm as the boy's efforts slowly stopped and the 2 boys sunk down into the depths, their lungs full of water.
When the raft rounded the bend and came upon the waiting teachers, who were alarmed at seeing just Peter alone on the raft, he began to weep and cry, exclaiming his horror over seeing his 2 classmates fall from the boat and drowned. And the teachers all showed tremendous sympathy for him. And it was at this point that Peter learned if he mimicked the emotions that were expected of him, he could get away with murder.
Chapter 2. The Dog Catcher. There were no other children in the industrial slum where little Peter Kürten dwelled with his large family, so Peter befriended one of the adult neighbors, a dog catcher who worked for the municipality. The dog catcher liked Peter and made him an unofficial apprentice, taking him out on his cart in search for stray dogs in the city.
Dog catchers in Germany at that time were much different than those of today. Basically, the man's job was to round up all the strays that roam the streets and kill them, then butcher them for their meat and sell the lard to doctors to fix cobwebs over wounds.
It was a cruel job for a cruel man, and Peter's dog catcher neighbor was a sadist who delighted in the torture of the dogs, often taunting them and torturing them while they were caged, breaking their limbs or stabbing them with a screwdriver.
And like Peter's father, this man too was a complete sexual deviant and would often masturbate in front of Peter, encouraging him to join him. He would also demonstrate to Peter how to masturbate a dog so that one could gain their trust and love. And incredibly disturbing, after killing a dog, this man would often have sex with the canine's corpse, laughing merrily all the while, which sparked a deep fascination with bestiality in Peter.
As Peter grew older, he would creep out to the industrial farms where stables of animals were kept on their way to the slaughterhouse, and copulate with pigs, goats, and sheep, hiding in the rafters and waiting for the place to shut down for the night, then creeping down to have his way with livestock.
But even this was not enough. The inner sadist needed to inflict pain, so he began to slash at the animals with a knife, the sight of their blood sending him into orgiastic ecstasy.
As sex, violence, and depravity began to coalesce in his teenaged mind, just cruelty began to be enough to make him climax.
He says when he was 14, he caught a squirrel in a snare. The creature bit his knuckle, so he quickly snapped its neck, and the act brought him to orgasm. And once he saw a wounded horse in the street bleeding to death, and just the sight of the bright red blood flowing over the cobblestones again brought him sexual release.
Another time he caught a swan and cut off its head, and the sight and sound of the gushing blood excited him so much that he brought the severed neck to his mouth and began to gulp down the blood as he simultaneously reached orgasm. He'd long treasure this memory, later saying,
"You can imagine how the blood rushes absolutely silently when you cut off the head of a swan."
He spent more and more time away from his hellish home life, squatting in abandoned apartments, sleeping on park benches or stables, learning how to steal food to survive, and becoming a thief.
Meanwhile, Peter's mother had finally reached the breaking point when she walked into the tiny apartment and found her husband in the act of raping their daughter. Horrified, she ran to the police, and Peter's father was arrested for incest and sent to prison.
When Peter learned his father was in prison, he returned home and actually went to his father's former employer looking for a job, which he was granted, working in the factory as a molder.
Peter was now the head of the household and breadwinner for the family. As the man of the house, Peter began to help himself to his father's previous spoils, namely his little sister. Incredibly disturbingly, after courting her and separating her from the rest of the family, Peter Kürten began to rape his own sister.
It was 1899, and Peter was 16 years old.
One day, Peter's mother came home to an awful yet somehow familiar sight. The children arranged in a circle around the bed, watching as Peter pummeled and sexually assaulted his sister. His mother, enraged with anger, attacked her son, but of course, Peter was grown now and beat her down before fleeing the apartment.
Knowing he had to escape town before the police were notified, Peter went to the factory where he worked, and using the keys he'd been given, went to the manager's office. He'd seen his boss open the safe several times and had managed to memorize the combination. He stole 300 Deutschmarks.
He absconded south down the Rhine River to the town of Koblenz. Here he met his match, a masochistic prostitute 10 years older than him, who specialized in working for sadists. She enjoyed being beaten, tortured, and humiliated, and Peter would later say, no matter how perverse or bizarre his sexual demands were upon her, there was nothing she was not willing to do.
It was a match seemingly made in heaven, and Peter moved into the back of the brothel where she worked. Those who knew them said that in public, Peter was quite kind to her. They were a happy couple, and he never demeaned her for being a prostitute.
It was in many ways a golden time for young Peter, who quickly made connections with the criminal underworld, finding where to fence stolen goods. But he was a clumsy burglar, and within a month, the local police were onto him, and he was arrested and thrown in jail, serving a short stint for fraud.
In August of 1899, Peter was released from prison and headed to the big city of Dusseldorf to try his luck. He was a snappy dresser and quite charming when he wanted to be, having learned how to put on the mask of sanity and offer whatever people wanted to manipulate them.
In November, while strolling along the Alstrabe, he met an 18-year-old girl and asked her to accompany him on a visit to the aristocratic and carefully crafted gardens in the city's Hofgarten.
It's not known whether the woman was a prostitute or just a young lady looking for thrills whom he was able to seduce. But off the beaten path, behind a topiary, the two began to make love. But the sadist within Peter needed more, so he wrapped his hands around her neck and began to strangle her, saying,
I seized her throat, and at once my sexual excitement truly began.
No record of this murder exists. It is believed he throttled her into unconsciousness, and after he fled, she eventually came to. But it marks a distinct chapter in his life, for he would say the climax he achieved during her death was the most profound and powerful in his life, and he realized the greatest heights of sexual ecstasy could only be achieved through violence and murder.
Peter went on with his criminal ways, robbing, cheating, and stealing, but he was again a bumbling criminal, and after trying to abduct a woman at gunpoint and firing a pistol at her as she escaped, he was again arrested, this time the judge throwing the book at him, and he was sentenced to 4 years of hard labor in Derendorf prison.
Chapter 3: Hard Time. In prison, Peter learned to manipulate the system, causing trouble before the hard labor was to begin so that he'd be thrown in solitary confinement rather than have to work. In solitary, he'd sit and fantasize about rape and murder. As he himself said,
Other prisoners think of naked women and masturbate, but I got no pleasure from it. I got my climax of enjoyment when I imagined something horrible. For instance, slitting up somebody's stomach, and how the public would be horrified. The thought of wounding was my peculiar lust, and it was in the way that I got my ejaculations. I can remember exactly how it happened in 1905 in the prison. There, for the first time, I got an ejaculation by thinking of grievous woundings and the actual killing of people. If I hadn't had that, I would have hung myself.
While in prison, he dreamed of murdering the entire world. As he said,
I thought of attacking staff, of setting the place on fire. I'd like to sabotage the railways to kill as many people as possible. If I had the means, I would have killed the masses. I would have caused catastrophes.
Meanwhile, there was a lot of international political intrigue at work in the world. France and Germany were growing increasingly antagonistic, especially when France made new claims on Morocco, and then signed the Triple Entente with Britain, essentially making them allies and isolating Germany. So the newly unified Germany was gearing up for war, and soldiers were needed, as well as factory workers. Peter was offered a pardon in exchange for immediate recruitment into the Imperial Army.
So in the summer of 1904, Peter was drafted into the Imperial German Army and assigned to the 98th Infantry Regiment and transported to the city of Lorraine in German-occupied northern France.
Peter was an awful soldier. He'd wander away, talk back, was disobedient, his insubordination causing weekly lashings, and by the end of the summer he'd run off and deserted, roaming the countryside along the French-German border. And now he'd found a new hobby to supply his sadistic thrills: arson.
Peter was a pyromaniac, which we see in many serial killers. Peter would set fire to barns and haylofts, then watch from a distance as emergency services came to extinguish the blazes. Seeing the destruction he caused gave him a sexual thrill, especially when he imagined people trapped inside the buildings being burned alive.
The army, meanwhile, was actively hunting him, and the fact that he was able to avoid detection led some to see him as having supernatural abilities. This German city boy in the countryside able to outflank the greatest military force in history. But he was eventually found hiding in a field and was soon sentenced to 8 years in the prison of Munster in North Rhine-Westphalia. Here he spent 90% of his time in solitary confinement. He began to dream of mass shootings, fires, utter destruction. He dreamed of challenging God himself and destroying creation.
Chapter 4: Dusseldorf. After serving his 8-year sentence, Peter was released from prison and he returned to Dusseldorf, marveling over the extensive network of trains that had been put in place during his incarceration. He realized he could take a train out to some small town, commit a robbery, especially in taverns and inns, then return back to the city unnoticed.
On the 25th of May, 1913, Peter took the train to Munster. There he broke into the upstairs window of a tavern, where he found little Christine Klein fast asleep in her bed. As Peter Kürten himself would later describe it,
"In the bed I saw a sleeping girl of about 10, covered with a thick feather bed. She was lying with her head towards the window. I seized her by the neck with my hands and throttled her for 1 or 2 minutes. The child woke up, struggled to free herself, scratched my hands, and then became unconscious and still. I drew her head over the edge of the bed, and with a small but sharp pocket knife, I made a deep cut in the throat of the child. I started on the left side of the throat, drawing the knife to the right with the right hand. I heard the blood gurgle and drip on the mat. It spattered on my hand. The whole business did not take more than 3 minutes."
he then slunk back into the night and onto a train back to Dusseldorf. This is the first confirmed murder by the vampire.
The next day, overcome by the memory, he returned and sat at an inn across from the tavern, watching as the police investigated and the town mourned. Peter even went to the funeral and returned to the grave at night, and just touching the fresh soil caused sexual release.
But the police discovered a clue. Peter had left a monogrammed handkerchief behind, his own initials in the corner, PK. Unfortunately, these were also the initials of the girl's father, Peter Klein, which led police to his brother, the girl's Uncle Otto, who just the night before had been seen having a very public argument over money with his brother in a pub and shouting,
"I'll do something you'll never forget."
And so the murder was pinned on Otto Klein. The belief was that it was the girl's father's handkerchief, and he'd either loaned it to his brother or had it been stolen by him.
Because of lack of evidence, Otto would be acquitted at the trial. But sadly, he'd become a pariah, shunned by his community and loathed by his family and friends. And with nowhere to turn, a year later, he enlisted in World War I and was killed on the battlefield.
Peter's skills as a thief greatly improved when he acquired a skeleton key that would unlock almost any door. God, the early 1900s were a wild time. Allowing him to slink into a house easily, with no noise, not leaving a trace, and instead of ransacking the place, he'd only take one or two expensive items that the owners would most likely consider misplaced.
And he continued starting fires, stealing kerosene for an accelerant, going out to industrial areas and starting blazes, watching from the distance as they grew and chaos spread, imagining the buildings full of people, imagining the entire world burning up with everyone in it. The thoughts of death and destruction pumping in his brain caused lust and sexual ecstasy.
One night, using his skeleton key, he slipped into a home that appeared empty and found 17-year-old Gertrude Franken sleeping in the moonlight. Overcome with lust, he straddled the sleeping girl and wrapped his hands around her neck.
Her airways constricted, the girl went into wild spasms as she fought for breath, bucking and thrashing, biting down on her own tongue and spitting out mouthfuls of blood, the sight of which sent Peter into the throes of sexual ecstasy. And as she went limp, he climaxed at just the sight of the blood, then ran off into the night.
Gertrude survived the brutal attack, and the police were called. Investigators found the incident incredibly troubling, as there was no sign of forced entry, none of the scratch marks that would be associated with lockpicking, her parents assuring investigators they had locked the door before going out for the evening. It was as if the perpetrator had slipped through the cracks like mist, or entered as a rodent or bat. Emboldened, Peter then acquired a small hatchet he called the chopper, attacking victims at random. As he said,
"In July 1913, I went with the chopper to Gershom about 9 o'clock in the evening. After a long search, I saw a man sitting on a park bench. I crept up to him and hit him on the head, and he collapsed without a sound. On my way back, I set fire to a cart laden with hay."
During this time, Peter committed 32 arsons, including 2 houses, 4 barns, a plantation, and an entire forest.
He was a fucking maniac on the loose. An absolute maniac. It's utterly terrifying. But it wasn't difficult for authorities to see this reign of horror that had come to Dusseldorf with the arrival of Peter Kürten. The fires, the robberies, the assaults, and soon police rounded him up and after beating him senseless, took him to court where he was given yet another 8-year sentence, again serving the majority of it in solitary confinement.
While Peter sat rotting in prison, fantasizing about death and destruction, murder and mayhem, the spilling and drinking of blood, another nightmare raged outside, not unlike Peter's twisted fantasies, the horror and trench warfare of World War I, a war which would see Germany definitively defeated on the world stage.
Chapter 5. Released Again. In April of 1921, Peter was released from prison yet again. He was now 38 years old and had spent over 17 of those years in prison.
It was a much different Germany than the one from which he'd left for prison. That was a Germany full of hope and vigor and prosperity. In 1921, after the humiliating defeat of World War I and the Treaty of Versailles, the country was struggling with severe economic difficulties, including hyperinflation that eroded the value of the German mark, leading to widespread poverty and social unrest. Political factions, ranging from communists to right-wing nationalists, vied for control, with frequent violent clashes in the streets. Amidst this instability, the German government also faced pressure from the Allied powers, which demanded the payment of reparations for the war.
He's kind of like David Carpenter, the Trailside Killer. Every time he gets out of prison, he just immediately goes on these insane crime sprees, then goes back to prison, missing whole generations of time. But at this point, an older Peter realized if he ended up back in prison again, in all likelihood, he would never be released. So he decided to pursue a straight life to the best of his abilities.
With no prospects, he sought out his youngest sister, who'd only been a toddler during the madness of his childhood, and had moved to the town of Altenburg near Dresden, far from her childhood home of Mulheim.
Peter's little sister was happily married mother now, and Peter was a complete stranger to her when he appeared on her doorstep, though seeing him must have come as a shock, as the last time she'd seen him, he'd been raping their sister. But her husband insisted blood was thicker than water and let Peter into their home and lives.
Peter told her he was a veteran of the Great War and had been a prisoner of war. His sister's husband, who'd also served in the military, was very sympathetic to his plight and insisted he move into a spare room in their house.
Peter, who had long learned the art of charm and manipulation, got along well with everyone and soon found a factory job and became involved with the union, which catered to his anti-authoritarian ways, and he soon ascended the union ranks. He organized picket lines, marched in solidarity with his fellow workers, and headed strikes. Finally, his rebelliousness and hatred of those in power had found an outlet.
He soon earned enough income to rent his own apartment, but stayed friendly with his sister and her family, often spending evenings with them.
And then Peter met Auguste Scharf in a candy shop in Altenburg. It was the perfect match, for she was a murderer as well.
Auguste had shot and killed her ex-fiancé and done time in prison for it. She'd also served a prison sentence for prostitution. Some say Peter found a kindred spirit, a Mina to his Dracula, that this man who hated the world found love with a woman. Others say she was a simple pawn in his game of chess, part of his mask of sanity.
The two soon married, and interestingly, they had a very tame sex life. By Peter Kürten's own admission in The Sadist, he only made love with her upon her provocations, just able to perform. For Peter, of course, sexual satisfaction only came with pain and blood and death, and so he spared Auguste that side of him.
While passionless, could this be love to Peter? Simply not inflicting cruelty and sadism on someone, though given the opportunity? Or did he spare her as part of his plan of gaslighting and manipulation?
They moved back to Dusseldorf, where Peter accepted a job as a union representative and organizer. There, Peter began having affairs, first with a servant named Tita. He lavished her with attention and gifts, but was also violent in bed, often choking her out.
When she asked him why he was like this, why he had to commit pain to find satisfaction, he coldly told her,
"This is what love means."
He also began seeing a housemaid named Mech, leaving her bruised and bloodied after their lovemaking.
But the word spread, gossip traveling, and soon Peter's wife learned of his infidelities, and then his mistresses went to the police, Mech saying he'd raped her on numerous occasions. Peter was brought in under the lesser charge of seduction and sentenced to 8 months in prison.
Peter vowed his love to his wife, apologizing, and August stuck with him, campaigning to have him released, appealing the court's decision, pouring all of their savings into trying to free him. And it worked. He was released from prison, though he was told to leave the city and never return.
But exile was no longer legal in Germany, and Peter's lawyer was able to fight the ruling, and he was allowed to stay. The court had apparently broken its own sentencing rules in demanding Peter leave Dusseldorf.
But Peter Kürten was a true monster, a sadistic vampire. While vowing to his wife August that he'd now be forever faithful, he was also going out in search of blood.
He wanted something that would cause the blood to spurt and squirt, a little hole like that of a fang, and saddled on a heavy pair of scissors, thinking they would make the perfect wound for blood to squirt out of.
And on February 3rd, 1929, he attacked Apollonia Kohn, a middle-aged woman going about her business. As he nonchalantly would describe it later in The Sadist,
On a Sunday evening, I strolled about the neighborhood in search of a victim. I had pocketed a pair of scissors for this purpose. Towards 6 o'clock, I saw a woman and went up to her and shouted, "Stop!" And then, with the scissors, I stabbed her blindly.
Surprisingly, though he'd stabbed her 24 times and punctured her lungs, Apollonia lived, but unfortunately could remember nothing of the attack, and was unable to describe her attacker at all.
Rosa Ollinger was 9 years old when Peter Kürten, the Vampire of Düsseldorf, snatched her off a footpath and dragged her into the bushes, strangling her into unconsciousness before cutting her open with the scissors, mutilating her genitals, slamming the scissors against her temple, and pushing until the sharpened points went into her skull and pierced her brain. And then, ripping the scissors free, he pressed his lips to the wound and drank her blood.
Stabbing the temple, as well as striking it, would become a signature. He then hid the body in the bush, below a bridge, and went to the movies. He later returned with a beer bottle full of gasoline. As he himself described it,
The next morning at 6 o'clock, I got up and told my wife I had to go to the bathroom. I then ran quickly to the scene of the crime, poured the gasoline over the body, and set it on fire. There and back did not take me more than 5 or 6 minutes. I felt no sexual excitement and did not touch the girl. My motive was only to cause excitement and indignation. I wanted to increase the general indignation by setting fire to the victim.
5 days later, on February 13th, Peter was again on the hunt. In the secluded suburban streets of Flingern Nord, where he came upon Rudolf Scheer, a 45-year-old mechanic. The vampire needed blood, and it didn't matter if it was man or woman, child or adult. He just needed pain, suffering, and most of all, blood, so he stabbed him repeatedly in the back with his scissors, then stabbed out his eyes, then again slammed the scissors into his temple.
He then just walked away, leaving the body there sprawled in the street, later joining a crowd who gathered to watch as the police investigated the murder.
Stabbing a victim in the temple was very unique, and forensics, as crude as it might have been, still being in its infancy, was able to identify the weapon as a pair of scissors, linking the recent murders. Investigators realized they had a madman killing indiscriminately on their hands, a man they named the Dusseldorf Monster.
So Peter changed his hunting grounds and his tactics. Between March and July, he strangled 4 different women, throwing one in the Rhine River, or so he later said, as there is actually no evidence of these murders. Perhaps he just throttled them into unconsciousness and they lived. Perhaps it was just a part of his imagination. It is theorized that some psychopaths live so deeply in their fantasies of murder that they begin to lose touch with reality and actually believe some of their fantasies to be reality.
But the murder of Maria Hahn in August of 1929 is beyond dispute. A lonely soul looking for a husband and soulmate, she ran into the Vampire of Düsseldorf.
Peter laid on the charm and manipulation, taking her on a date in the Neanderthal district. As they strolled out into an isolated meadow, Peter attacked, choking her into unconsciousness, stabbing her with the scissors, pulling up her skirts and raping her as he sucked the blood from a wound in her neck.
Peter Kürten, the Vampire of Düsseldorf, sucked so much blood from the poor woman's neck that he began to vomit up stomachfuls of it.
And he again performed his signature move, stabbing her in the temple with his scissors.
He would later say that his kill was the pinnacle of his life of sadism, the most perfect act of horror and vampirism, the highlight of his sad and depraved existence. Everything before had been leading to this point, and everything afterward would be an attempt to recapture it.
He hid the body and then went home to his wife, who exclaimed over the blood all over him, which makes you wonder just how complicit August was in this love affair of theirs. But her concern led him to think he should hide the body better so that no one found it. So he returned later with a shovel, dragged the corpse out to a meadow by some agricultural fields, and buried it very deeply.
Afterwards, he scoured the newspapers for word of the missing girl, a police investigation, something, but no one seemed to notice her absence. Reading about his crimes and seeing the panic he induced helped him relive them and sexually fetishize them, so he grew frustrated that his greatest triumph had gone unnoticed and came up with a dark and very disturbing plan. He would dig up her body and nail it to a nearby tree, crucify her for all to see.
So he returned to her grave in the dead of night and dug up her rotting corpse, intent on dragging it to the forlorn oak and nail her hands into the thick branches, crucifying the body in a mockery of Christ that would shock and offend the world. An ultimate end to the most ultimate of victims in orgiastic blood-drinking achievements.
But she was heavier than he'd anticipated, her body difficult to move, and as he pulled her free, the horrible smell of death rising up, he was filled with an awful lust, and instead of crucifying her, he had sex with the body and reburied it. For weeks, he'd return over and over to dig her up and have sex with the slowly decaying body.
As do nearly all of these guys. So fucking disgusting. Peter Kürten really sets the template for the serial killer eruption that was spring in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. Sadistic, necrophiliac lust killer.
Chapter 6. The Vampire of Düsseldorf. At this point, Peter realized he had to get rid of his precious scissors and found himself a knife.
On August 21st, in the early morning, in an absolute state of insanity, he began attacking random strangers with his new knife. He walked up to an 18-year-old girl and began stabbing her before darting away, then went and attacked a 30-year-old man. Finally, he closed a horrible stabbing spree with a 37-year-old woman.
With each victim, he'd attempted his stab through the temple, but none had managed to penetrate the skull, and none of them died, but they were all seriously wounded and hospitalized.
It's so fucking scary, man. You're just walking along, coming through some deserted, spooky area, the shadows looming, and out of the trees pops this absolute maniac, a fucking vampire, hungry for blood, that just starts stabbing you and darts back away again.
Police interviewed the victims of the knife attacks, and they all describe a very plain-looking middle-aged man. The most remarkable thing about him was his unremarkableness.
And when you look at pictures of him, you can see this creepy ordinariness, a plainness, which goes along with this mask of sanity a psychopath wears motif. Like there's no him there, just a void and emptiness.
Just 3 days later, Peter was lurking by an outdoor market when he saw two little orphan girls, 14-year-old Louise Lenzen and her 5-year-old foster sister, Gertrude Hamacher, walking away from the booths and into a field of runner beans to admire their flowers in the glow of the setting sun.
Peter approached them and laid on his charm as the dark shadows of evening fell over the scene, offering to pay Louise to go and fetch him a pack of cigarettes, which she eagerly did, leaving her foster sister in the strange man's care.
As soon as Louise had disappeared into the distant market, Peter reached out and grasped the babbling 5-year-old Gertrude by the neck, lifting her off the ground as he throttled her into unconsciousness. Then laying her down, slicing open her throat, and tossing the tiny corpse into the tangle of the bean field.
When Louise returned with the cigarettes, questioning where her foster sister had run off to, Peter plunged his knife into her neck, clamped his lips to the wound as blood spattered out, and eagerly sucked the lifeblood from the young girl's body, ripping at the wound with his teeth as he did so, gnashing into her flesh and tumbling to the ground with her as he stabbed her again and again, the knife piercing her ribs and slicing her heart before he shuddered into orgasm, mouth filled with hot blood, and rolled off of her satiated.
Incredibly, the girl then stood up and managed to take a few sad and forlorn steps before tumbling over dead in the beans.
Peter then calmly strode away, disappearing into the night, the vampire leaving the corpses of the two children where they lay.
When they were discovered, pathologists noted the teeth marks in Louise's neck, surrounding the puncture wound, and the name of the creature who'd killed them was changed from the monster to the Vampire of Düsseldorf.
Peter cherished the name and his newfound fame. He strutted about town as if a celebrity. One evening, coming across a woman named Gertrude Schultz, crossing the Rhine Bridge to Oberkassel.
Feeling invigorated and full of himself, he boldly propositioned her, grabbing her up and saying,
"Come, see if you can feel it. I've only a small tail."
When she countered, "I would rather die," Peter shrugged, drew his knife, and bellowed,
"Well, die then,"
before stabbing her in the back so hard that the blade broke off. The woman fell bleeding into the gutter, and the Vampire of Düsseldorf calmly went on his merry way.
Thankfully, she was quickly discovered and rushed to a hospital where she miraculously recovered and lived to tell her horrifying experience with the creature of the night.
Again, when asked to describe her attacker, she could only say he looked incredibly ordinary and nondescript, just a very plain-looking man in his 40s. And the random attacks continued with whatever random weapon he could find, sometimes just a chisel, as he said.
In the autumn of 1929, I met a couple in the Rosstrasse. I wanted to interfere, So I hit the man over the head with a chisel. The man ran away. Then I hit the girl several times with the chisel. She fell down, and I went off.
Like many psychopaths who have gotten away with murder, Peter began to feel unstoppable and relished the attention in the press. Now it wasn't just the blood, pain, and sense of domination that fueled him, but the notoriety and fame. And like Jack the Ripper in England before him, Peter began to write letters to the police, telling them about the murder of Maria Hahn, giving disturbing details about her rape and murder, describing how good it felt, saying how he cherished visiting the site of her death over and over, even including a crude map to her burial site.
And on November 15th, 1929, using the map he'd sent them, the police discovered her grave.
And Peter was still at it. One woman he attacked with a knife, leaving her to die. Another he choked into unconsciousness and began to assault before being driven off by approaching pedestrians. Both women lived to tell their horrible tales.
Chapter 7. The Hammer.
It was at this point that Peter changed his murder weapon yet again. Partly he wanted something with even more brutality. Partly he wanted to convince police there was another, different madman on the loose.
The instrument he chose was a hammer, which he began to carry in his coat pocket, feverishly gripping the shaft as he hunted victims in the back alleys and shadows of Dusseldorf.
Ida Ruder was new to the city, working as a servant girl, when she met the charming, well-dressed man on the street, who convinced her to join him for a drink at a small cafe near the train station.
It was a beautiful spring day, and since she was new to the city, the man convinced her to let him take her on a tour through the beautiful Hofgarten, the same place where the vampire had committed his first sex murder 20 years earlier.
As they strolled along the banks of the Rhine River, the man told Ida about his youth. As a child, he'd made rafts with the other children and floated them down the river. The sun was setting, and it was that magical moment of amber light when everything seems perfect. And the kind man turned to her, smiling, and she was prepared and ready to be kissed. Only he wasn't trying to kiss her. Instead, he was swinging a hammer down, cracking her in the side of the head, that soft spot, the temple, knocking her unconscious.
When she awoke, the man was atop her, actively sexually assaulting her. She tried to scream but could only mumble. Her head throbbed and swam, and she managed to murmur,
"Please stop. You're hurting me."
The man grinned in absolute pleasure, his eyes black and sparkling, and he thrust harder.
"No," she cried. "No," her pleading getting louder.
It was then that Peter Kürten began to strike with the hammer, beating her head in with each thrust, crushing her skull and spilling her brains out. And in the book, The Sadist, there's photographs of her skull with these huge hunks of it missing. It is gnarly and just truly very disturbing to see. Maybe we'll put the picture up on social media.
On the 11th of October, he met Elizabeth Dorier outside of a theater and struck up a conversation, laying on the charm and enticing her to visit a cafe to continue discussing the play she'd just seen. They then went to the train station and took a day trip out to Fraffenburg to stroll along the Klein-Dussel River.
Again, at the point when the woman suspected the charming man may try to kiss her, he instead smashed her in the head with a hammer. Again, he sexually assaulted her, and as he did so, bludgeoned her head in. Miraculously, she was still breathing when discovered by a passerby, and she was rushed to the hospital, but unfortunately, she succumbed to her wounds and died in the hospital.
On the 25th of October, the vampire again went on the hunt with his hammer. He attacked one woman randomly, as he would later say,
I noticed a woman going down the dark Hellweg. I followed her and started a conversation about the Egyptian darkness and about the general unsafety. As I knew the surroundings pretty well, I made up my mind to commit the crime there. I took a step back and gave her a heavy blow with the hammer on the right temple. I don't know whether I actually hit the temple. The woman collapsed without a sound. I gave her more hammer blows as she lay on the ground. I took her attaché case and went back down the Hellweg. Later on, I threw away the case.
Later that same night, he encountered a prostitute smoking a cigarette, and they went into the brush to have intercourse, where he beat her until the head of the hammer broke and the head part flew off into the bushes. He ran off and returned later looking for the head of the hammer, but couldn't find it.
With his hammer out of commission, the vampire returned to his beloved scissors. And on November 7th, Peter headed out to the Flingren district, to an area of abandoned allotments, roving the streets, gripping the scissors in his sweaty hands, when he came upon a lost 5-year-old girl named Gertrude Aberman.
As he himself described the incident,
I met a little girl. I talked to her. We went into the open field across from some allotments. The child went with me quite willingly and did not cry. I seized the child's throat, and as I strangled, I lifted her up and stabbed her in the left temple. The child collapsed without a sound. With my left hand, I held fast to her throat, knelt down, and stabbed the child's breast with my right hand.
Satiated, the vampire scooped up her tiny body and secreted her in a tall patch of weeds beside an abandoned building, covered her corpse in garbage, marked the area with a cross. He then wrote letters to the police as well as a communist newspaper saying,
"Murder at Papendal. In the place marked by a cross, a corpse lies buried."
He then staked the area out and watched as police searched and eventually discovered the body, laughing the entire time.
Throughout February and March, Peter Kürten randomly attacked 10 more people with his scissors, never causing death, but severely maiming and disabling them.
Chapter 8. Inspector Ernst Gnott. So the police think that there are multiple murderers roaming the city, one using scissors, one using a hammer, one a knife, and one his bare hands to strangle.
Yeah, they must have thought Dusseldorf was just filled with psychopathic murderers. But remember, it is this really big, bustling city, and there was a constant influx of new people coming in. The train station was always packed, people pouring in from all over Europe and Germany.
But frustrated that the investigations are going nowhere, the police bring Berlin's chief inspector, the famous Ernst Gnott, to take over the case.
This guy is absolutely legendary in true crime. He solved 298 murder cases and actually was using the German equivalent of the word serial killer back in the late 20s to refer to these guys 50 years before the FBI would. He's even got his own Wikipedia page, and if he sounds familiar, that's because he was in last year's episode on Fritz Hamann, the werewolf of Hanover. A very, very similar case, exact same circumstances. Hanover had to call him in for help on all these murderers, and he rolls in and solved the case. Now, many think there may have been a serial killer explosion in Germany during this period, like America in the 70s and early 80s. But others think there was always that many serial killers, and what happened was Germany just got really, really good at catching them, and that is why we know about so many of them.
Inspector Gnott examined the evidence and was able to deduce that all of the attacks were committed by the same person. And after interviewing all the witnesses, Gnott brought in an artist to make a profile sketch. He also brought in experts in psychiatry, including students of Sigmund Freud, to understand the sadistic motives at work. to create a profile in order to understand the killer's thinking. Way, way ahead of his time. Again, this guy has his own Wikipedia page. Fascinating. Give it a look.
The psychiatrist theorized that violence had replaced the sexual impulse, and that acts of violence now fulfilled the desire for sex in his mind. The two had become linked. This was one of the first attempts of psychiatry to try to understand the mind of a sexually motivated serial killer.
These psychiatrists had also discovered that many violent sex criminals were also pyromaniacs and suggested they add known arsonists to their lists as well, which is how the name Peter Kürten ended up there.
Inspector Gannat also brought in a graphologist or handwriting expert to look over the 13,000 letters that had been sent to the police. And the graphologist was able to confirm the letters written by the vampire to the police and press were by the same person.
The police conducted a staggering 9,000 interviews, and over 2,000 clues were examined.
Meanwhile, Peter went on, casually strolling the streets and acting out in spontaneous fits of violence.
His words are so calm and chilling. He says,
"In the middle of March 1930, I offered to treat a girl to a beer at Schumacher's. She told me she was not averse from perversions. We decided to practice some of those, and for that purpose went to Grafenberg Wald. There, I suddenly strangled her, but she managed to free herself and ran off."
On May 14th, 1930, Maria Butlis arrived in Dusseldorf on a train for Cologne. Dusseldorf was crowded and bustling, and she became lost in the maze, trying to find the boarding house where she'd booked a room. A kindly man approached her and offered to be her guide, but as he led her from the crowded streets to a quieter part of town, and eventually to a deserted park, she began to grow uneasy. Everyone knew of the Dusseldorf vampire, after all. When she refused to enter the park with him, he began to berate her, saying it was a known shortcut, and she was an ignorant, bumbling country girl, when a bystander finally stepped in and intervened, asking her if the man was bothering her, at which point the man angrily stormed off.
The bystander extended his apologies on the behalf of the great city of Dusseldorf, and promising her it was a welcoming place, offered to guide her to her boarding house and take her to dinner. That man was Peter Kürten.
He took her back to an apartment he kept for trysts such as these, wined her and dined her and propositioned her, but she was exhausted and in no mood for courtship, and rebuffed his advances.
Fearing a nonplussed gentleman, he cordially began to escort her to her boarding house, but then led her into Grafenberg woods, seized her by the neck, pinned her to a tree, and sexually assaulted her. But in an odd twist, he didn't beat her, he didn't kill her. In fact, afterwards, he helped her get her garments in order and escorted her back to the train station, giving her succinct directions to her boarding house.
The woman never went to the police, never reported it, but she did write a letter about the incident to a relative, saying she felt like she had been in the hands of a murderer. And indeed she had, and Kürten would later say the only reason he hadn't killed her was because so many people had seen them together.
The relative, horrified at what they read, took the letter to Inspector Gannat.
The woman was questioned and not only gave a detailed description of the man, but led police to the apartment on Mannerstrasse, rented by one Peter Kürten, who was already on their very, very long list.
But Peter actually saw her leading the detectives to his apartment, and realizing that he was in trouble, fled to the only real friend that he had in the world, his loyal wife, Auguste.
Much is made in modern lore about the relationship between Auguste and Peter Kürten. Some claim she was the only person he ever loved, that he adored her, and see the whole tale as a dark and disturbing love story about a man who hated the world but loved his wife. Others say she was a pawn in his wicked games, and that such a psychopath was incapable of feeling love.
Peter told Auguste that he was, quote, responsible for the Boutier's affair, but he claimed it had not been rape, but a consensual act.
We can't know for certain what Auguste was thinking or how much she actually knew. She herself was an ex-prostitute and murderer, after all. But at this point, she seems to have just thought he'd been having an affair and seeing other women, and she told him to lay low and let the matter blow over.
So Peter found a safe house, an apartment in the Adlerstrasse district, and hid out for a while, but eventually returned to his flat to find his wife there. When he asked her why she wasn't working in the middle of the day, she said she had been at work, but the police had come questioning her and had taken her back to their apartment for an interview, and that they weren't going to just let this matter blow over.
Peter claims she was despondent, wondering how she was going to survive if Peter went back to prison, weeping over thoughts of starvation and destitution, even proposing they both commit suicide together.
It was at this point, so he says in The Sadist, that he told her that he was, in fact, the Vampire of Düsseldorf, saying, quote, I have done everything that has happened here in Dusseldorf.
What do you mean by that?
Everything. The murders and the attacks, the fires as well.
What, those innocent children too?
Yes.
Why did you do that?
I don't know myself. It just came over me.
At first she didn't believe him, thought he'd gone mad, but as he began to give her detail after detail of the assaults and murders, she saw that her husband was indeed the Vampire of Düsseldorf. Why are you telling me this? She said.
He told her it was because of the reward. If she turned him in, she could collect the reward, and she would be taken care of while he was in prison. He then instructed her to go and tell the police all that he had told her.
So while Peter sat waiting under the Gothic arches of St. Roch's Church, Auguste went to the Inspector Gnot and began to tell him all she knew, and soon a cadre of armed officers was headed to the church.
Peter greeted them, unarmed, and went without a fight.
And he confessed, but claimed there was no sexual component to any of the crimes, but that he was taking revenge on society, and describing his horrible childhood as the reason he killed.
He went out of his way to insist he never tortured the children like he had done with the adults, which is utter nonsense and just another mask of sanity he was trying to wear to appear human. He said he was not the one to fault, that it was society's fault. Society was built to make men like him. And what did they expect? Look at his childhood. He'd been programmed to be a monster, he told them. It was all a horrible act of revenge. He hated the world and was a creature of hatred, and the entire planet was his enemy and had to pay.
Many psychiatrists sought to interview him, fighting for the opportunity, the court finally settling on the very respected Dr. Karl Berg.
Dr. Berg saw through all of Peter's claims of revenge and childhood drama, sussing out that his motivation was purely sexual and purely selfish, saying, quote,
In the beginning, he denied to me the sexual significance and invited me to believe his old motives, vengeance on human society. But I explained to him that he was giving himself away by starting each confession with the same formula. Quote, I went out to search for a victim. End quote. To that objection, Kurten replied,
The sexual urge was strongly developed in me, and it was stimulated by the crimes themselves. Sometimes, even when I seized my victim's throat, I had an orgasm. Sometimes not, but then the orgasm came as I stabbed the victim. It was not my intention to get satisfaction by normal sexual intercourse, but by killing.
This also explained why certain victims went free while others did not. If he was able to achieve an orgasm before he killed them, satisfied, he'd just let them go. The ones that were the most mutilated were the ones that took him the longest to climax.
When asked why he changed weapons, he said it was partly to throw police off and make it appear that there were more than one killer, but that ultimately, quote, whether I took a knife or a pair of scissors or a hammer in order to see blood was a matter of indifference to me or mere chance. Often after the hammer blows, the bleeding victims moved and struggled, just as they did when they were throttled.
As his trial loomed, the press went crazy and dubbed him the king of the sexual perverts.
I'm not one of the greedy kind. All of my wants are simple. I know what's on my mind.
Chapter 9, The Trial and the Pleasures to End All Pleasures.
Resting until I find what would make your eyes glisten with joy. Now listen, big boy.
Peter pled not guilty by reason of insanity, but Dr. Bergad had already established his competency before the trial even began. Peter was brought to court shackled in a cage, supposedly to protect him from the families of the victims.
But on just the second day of the trial, he changed his plea to guilty, saying,
I have no remorse. As to whether recollection of my deeds makes me feel ashamed, I will tell you, thinking back to all the details is not at all unpleasant. I rather enjoy it.
When the judge asked if he had any conscience, he stated,
I have none. Never have I felt any misgiving in my soul. Never did I think to myself that what I did was bad, even though human society condemns it. My blood and the blood of my victims must be on the heads of my torturers. The punishments I have suffered have destroyed all my feelings as a human being. That was why I had no pity for my victims.
When asked why he'd turned himself in if he enjoyed it so much and had no conscience, he said,
Don't you understand that I am fond of my wife, and that I am still very fond of her? I have done many wrongs, have been unfaithful over and over again. My wife has never done any wrong. Even when she heard of my many prison sentences I have served, she said, I won't let you down. Otherwise, you'll be lost altogether. And so I wanted to fix for my wife a carefree old age.
I wanna be loved by you.
It took the jury less than 2 hours to find him guilty on all 9 counts of murder and 7 counts of attempted murder, and give him a sentence of death for each and every one of them. After being sentenced, Peter calmly turned to the court and said,
My crimes are so ghastly that I do not want to make any sort of excuse for them.
For his last meal, he ordered Wiener Schnitzel, fried potatoes, and a bottle of white wine. He asked for seconds, and the prison agreed. He then asked for pen and paper, and to everyone's surprise, wrote letters of apologies to all the victims' families. He then wrote a final letter of goodbye to his beloved August.
He was then taken to the guillotine at dawn. The sky, the color of the blood that so excited the vampire of Dusseldorf. On one side of him sat a pastor, and on the other side, psychiatrist, which really seems to sum up the 1930s in a way, the dichotomy of faith and science in this new modern age.
Take a tip from me, for I am all the evil music has.
As they secured him in the pillory and placed his head beneath the gleaming blade, he turned to the executioner and asked,
After my head is chopped off, will I still be able to hear for a moment? To hear the sound of my own blood gushing from the stump of my neck? That would be a pleasure to end all pleasures. And at 6 a.m., the blade was released and came swiftly down, slamming into his neck and cleanly cutting the head of the Dusseldorf vampire free from his body.
His head was taken to be studied by medical science. It was bisected, the brain removed, and the two halves mummified.
The brain was studied in detail, doctors and medical experts searching for any abnormalities they could find. But there was nothing. Both his brain and his body were extraordinarily ordinary.
Carl Berg wrote several books over the years, including The Sadist, which is considered the first psychological study to have ever been conducted on a serial killer, and the template for the modern true crime book. There's an e-version on the internet for free. We'll put a link in the show notes and invite you to read it for yourselves.
15 years later, as World War II came to an end in Europe, American troops did some looting in Germany, and one of them grabbed the two halves of Peter Kürten's mummified head, bringing them back to the United States with them as a grim souvenir. Eventually, the vampire's head found its way to the Ripley's Believe It or Not Museum in Wisconsin, where you can go and see it to this day, hanging there on a rusty chain.
Does the ghost of Peter Kürten haunt the Ripley's Believe It or Not Museum? Was Peter truly in love with August? Is this a twisted love story of sorts? Were his crimes an act of revenge on society, or the selfish urges of sadistic psychopathy? You tell us your thoughts, dear listeners.
And that is the story of Peter Kürten, the dreaded, vile, and disgusting Vampire of Düsseldorf. And we hope that you enjoyed it.
Thanks so much for listening. And thanks for joining us in Vampire October.
And you got a case you'd like to hear us cover? Let us know. Reach us at murdercoasterpodcast@gmail.com. That's murdercoasterpodcast@gmail.com. We will see you next week with more tales of vampires.